This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome everyone to today's Economy Committee meeting. Members of the public may like to follow us on at London Assembly on Twitter, or X as it's known, and use the hashtag Assembly Economy for this meeting. Please may I remind everyone in the room to switch their phones to silent mode, and I ask members and guests to ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Members are also, and guests are also reminded to position their microphones so that they can be heard clearly. This is a demonstration. They're right in front of you that way. And if you move your microphone, please do so by picking it up from the base, not from here, because people get very upset when they break. Today, our main item of business is on child poverty. This topic, I'm very pleased to be able to do this week. It takes place in London Challenge Poverty Week, the initiative that aims to highlight the injustice of poverty in London, showing that there are already many solutions to put an end to poverty and bring the reality of a poverty-free London one step closer. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our committee clerk, Jack Booth, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies for absence from Assembly Member Clark, for whom Assembly Member Baker is substituting. We also have apologies from Assembly Member Garrett, for whom Assembly Member Lord Bailey is substituting.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest from members? Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask members if they have any other interest to declare? Okay. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on 14th June and 13 July to be signed by me as a correct record? Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings?
Agreed.
Can I ask the committee to note the response from the Mayor to barriers to work for people who have had contact with the criminal justice system as attached at Appendix 1? We now move on to our main item of business, a discussion with our invited guests on child poverty in London. After the first set of questions, we will have a short adjournment at around 11 o'clock for 10 minutes. At this moment, we are joined in the chamber by Tom Lee, Senior Analyst at Child Poverty Action, Katherine Hill, Strategic Policy Manager at 4 in 10, London's Child Poverty Network, Chris Price, Chief Policy Executive Officer at Pecan, Clara Scrivenkova, my apologies, Clara, Director of Programmes at Trust for London, Debbie Weeks-Bernard, Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice at the GLA, and Dan Julesma Milgrom, Senior Manager, Equality and Fairness, Communities and Social Policies at the Greater London Authority, the GLA. And can we make these titles a bit shorter, please? Welcome and thank you all for joining us. I will start with the first questions, and they are for Katherine, Clara, Tom and Chris. And as always, I would ask members to be as quick as possible in their questioning, and I wonder, because we've got such a big panel and so much to get through this morning, if we could have shortish answers from the panel as well. We always like to hear from you, but we've got a lot to get through. So, what are the main drivers and causes of child poverty in London at present? Katherine, could we start with you?
Thank you, Chair. As you say, we could be here a lot longer than all morning discussing the myriad causes of child poverty in London. I think at its root, the reason why there are such high levels of child poverty in London in comparison to some of the other regions of the country is very much shown by the figures themselves. So when we put housing costs into the figures, that's when London shoots to the top of the league table of child poverty. So it is about the very high costs of living in London as a family. Housing costs are very much central to that. We know that the child poverty rate at least doubles when housing costs are accounted for in 20 out of the 33 London boroughs. And we know some of the reasons for that. Housing is obviously an issue that the Assembly looks at a lot. We know that rents have skyrocketed and the government's continued freeze on LHA makes the situation impossible for many families. So, front and centre is very high housing costs, equally very high childcare costs. We ran a survey with colleagues at the GLA a couple of years ago where we talked to people experiencing financial difficulties about their perception of poverty in London. And they cited childcare costs as even more of a driver of poverty than housing. Although the figures might tell us differently, it's interesting that was their perception. That is a real driver of hardship. I think on top of that, in recent times, if we look at the impact of inflation, we know that, we all know that the impact that inflation has had on the cost of living over the last few years. In London, that is even higher. In some cases, the inflation rate is higher in London, and for those families on lowest incomes, it's even higher. So that for a family on a low income to attain the same standard of living as in 2020, those Londoners now need to spend an extra 27% a week to buy the same goods. So that's the kind of at the core of it. On the other side of the coin, as it were, if we think about incomes, in-work poverty is a very significant factor. 3/4 of the children living in poverty in London have at least one parent who has a job. And so that points us to looking at wage rates and the fact that you can be in a good job and still not able to put food on the table for your children. I'll let my colleagues come in a minute, but I suppose the other final piece of the jigsaw on the income side of things is to think about benefit levels and about how these have been eroded over time over the last recent years. Although there has been some uprating, they've lost a huge amount of their value and worth, and it's very clear now that if we look at campaigns that colleagues, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Trussell Trust are running to increase benefit levels to what they call an essential guarantee to ensure that basic benefit rates cover the cost of essentials. The fact is that isn't currently the case, and that is a reason pushing people into experiencing poverty.
Thank you, Katherine. Clara?
Well, Katherine covered all of the key drivers of poverty, and I agree with everything that was already said. Housing costs is the one key driver. So I'm not going to repeat what Katherine has said, but what I want to highlight is the context in which we are looking at child poverty, and that's poverty overall, poverty of households and poverty of families. And we need to always see both the way we analyze poverty, but also look at solutions as a solution that is looking at the context of the whole family. And that's where the point around low pay comes in significantly. High costs and low income create a poverty trap. And that's something that we need to be thinking about. And Katherine's data and what she mentioned about 32% of households in poverty are households where at least one of the parents are working is significant. And that's one of the ways to measure and potentially look for solutions is how do we increase household incomes for those who are in low pay? And why is there such a high percentage of low pay, and how do we understand it? And I think that's where sort of conversations around living wage come into place. The other thing to take into account is the so-called poverty premium. The less money you have, the more money you often need for essentials. And we all know about issues like pay meters and all of that, prepay meters and all of that. So I think poverty premium is another thing that should not be there and should not be acceptable, but is contributing to child poverty. And the other thing to add to it, and if you look across the populations in London that are more likely to be in poverty, again, Black and minoritized group, but also disabled Londoners. So if you look at children that live in households where there are disabled parents or children that are disabled, those costs will be higher again. So the poverty premium or the cost of disability on the top of that will be causing child poverty. So my key comment really would be about let's look at child poverty, but also not forget the context of overall poverty.
Thank you, Clara. Tom?
So I agree with everything my previous panellists have just said. Two more points I'd like to make. So one is the two-child limit. London is disproportionately affected by the two-child limit. So in some boroughs, there's 3 in 10 children, of all children, not just those in poverty, live in houses affected by the two-child limit. And we know that's the key driver of rising child poverty going forward. And and also it doesn't save much money. Most cost-effective way to reduce child poverty. And then also there's a question about deep poverty, of which the benefit cap is a key contributor. So even though the cap is higher in London, because rents are so much higher in London, London is still disproportionately affected, and there are places in London where after your rent and after being capped, families are being forced to live off as little as £44 a week, and this is also kind of the benefit cap and the LHA freeze have contributed to a rise in the number of children in temporary accommodation, which is over 80,000 now, and really 50 million here is spent each month to kind of try and tackle this issue kind of at the end, but instead if there was sort of more preventative steps taken earlier, it would be sort of potentially cost effective and sort of increase the standard of living and reduce the depth of poverty for these families.
Thank you, Tom. Chris?
For us, we run things like food banks, food pantries as well. The thing that constantly comes over to us is that people do not have enough income to meet the expenditures that are happening. That is the story time after time as we talk to people. I think everything that everyone else has said has really, that is what it is, that there are these different areas where people are not getting their money in through the benefits, through the caps on benefits, through rising costs, through rising housing costs as well. And people's income has stayed the same, so therefore they don't have enough money. And what we're seeing more and more is, on top of this, then comes a mental health issue, which comes through the struggle of trying to survive in this climate, which then puts people further away from the job market as well. So you've got all these factors adding together to actually keep people in a place where they are not able to survive, and they're not actually seeing that route out of it as well. So it becomes a long-term issue because of the financial crisis that they're living in at the moment.
Thank you. And you've all given a really good context as to what the picture is in London. My next question is going to be about the impact, and again to you all, to the four of you that asked, what impact does growing up in poverty have on children in London, both in the short and the long term? And if we could go in reverse, so perhaps Chris, if you could start, please.
We see the impact in the fact that people are struggling. What we also see there for children as well is that they are more likely not to be attending, so the lower income households struggle to attend school more regularly, so that has an impact on their education, which is a short-term impact on socialising. It also has that long-term impact on their ability to thrive later in life as well. So that for us is a key impact that we see. We are seeing more and more households who are working coming through to the food banks. We have at least 12% who say that they are working and they're needing to use a food bank. So that puts that extra stress onto the family as well. And that stress is also felt by the children. So you've got this real impact, not just the financial impact of this, but it's actually the mental health impact, which will affect generation after generation as well.
Thank you. Tom, could you bring your microphone closer to you, please? Thank you.
Pick any metric you want, really, and children growing up in poverty will sort of fare worse than their peers. And also, the kind of impact on on parental mental health, shouldn't be underestimated as well. But I think there is a kind of to try and provide some hope. There is a growing body of evidence that looks at the effect of increased social security on these outcomes, and they find that children have better health outcomes, they get better grades, they have better developmental outcomes, and that means in later life they get better jobs, pay more taxes, have better health in adult life, and live longer. So it's not a yeah, you can do something about it. I understand that the kind of the sort of the resources kind of are sort of like if you can't just spend money on everything, but I think it's a win-win-win, and it's kind of studies have found that it's incredibly kind of highly cost-effective investment for the government. It should be seen as an investment in these children to kind of not only improve the standard of living, but also kind of later life, later productivity, health outcomes too.
Thank you. Clara.
In terms of looking at impact on growing up in poverty, I would encourage members to watch a video, some of you might have already seen, that was made by children from the St. Anthony's Primary School. It's a song. It's called Look to the Sky. It's available on YouTube, and it tells you, in the words of children, what it's like to be growing up in low-paid household and in low pay. The fear, the worry that a child shouldn't have, the observation of parents skipping meals, the constant stress and anxiety, the shame and the impact of that. I would invite you to watch that, because I think it's the best way to really hear from the mouth of those who have seen it themselves or in their friends. The other point I wanted to make in terms of the impact is the impact it has on intergenerational social mobility. Again, recently I was talking to one of our funded partners who works with people from the Latin American community in London, and who said how sad for them it is to see young women leaving education early or stopping education because of the pressure to go and contribute to the family income. And the consequence of that is they end up having the same insecure, exploitative, low-paid jobs like their mothers, like their parents had. And that is an impact of growing up in poverty, where the pressure is to earn money now, and there is no luxury to think about investing into education for better income in the future.
Thank you, Clara. Katherine.
Thank you. I endorse what my colleagues have said, and just to add a few points. I think it's really helpful, and at 4 in 10 we very much see this in terms of looking through a human rights lens, so the impact of poverty on children's human rights. So we see children in our city being denied their basic human rights to adequate food, to decent health, to a safe home, and I think those are the terms in which we ought to see this. It also prevents children from thriving and meeting their full potential later in life. There are a group of young people today presenting to the Child Poverty Summit that's taking place on Oxford Street. And those young people I know are going to be speaking about the barriers that being on a low income puts in their way to meeting their dreams and ambitions. A lot of these are young people who've excelled in school. Their schools have served them well in London. They've come out with really good grades, and yet they still don't have equal opportunities to work experience placements, to the social and cultural capital that other young people enjoy, that help them to get on into the next stages of life and to put those qualifications to good use and to contribute to our city. And I think speaking to those young people in preparation for their contribution today, the frustration is palpable, and they have so much to offer and give, and yet they are being held back by not having full opportunities. As others have said, the impact on child and parental health, both mental health and physical health, is very clear. I currently at the moment am sitting on an advisory group to a group of young peer researchers at Toynbee Hall who are looking at the impact of the cost of living crisis on the mental health of themselves and their parents, and essentially the relationship between them as well, because the damaging impact, as Chris is saying, on the relationship of people being in a household where struggle is the constant, means that young people don't feel they're able to turn to their parents or carers for support, because they know that they're so aware of the pressures that they're under. So that's a sort of interesting dynamic that those young people are digging into, and hopefully you'll be able to look at the outcome of their research in coming months. Physical health, we mustn't forget physical health. I always think the figures around dentistry is really instructive when we're thinking about the impact of poverty on children. Some research from the British Dental Association this year found that 83% of secondary teachers say that they or their school have been giving out toothbrushes and toothpaste to children because they simply don't have them. And the final point I'd make is just to kind of spare some thought for the issues around area deprivation. We know that we live in a very unequal city, and that, for example, air pollution exposure is highest in the most income-deprived areas of London, and children are disproportionately exposed to the highest levels of pollution there. So, yeah, there is so much we could talk for days on the impact of child poverty, but those are some of the things I would pull out.
Thank you very much. For the next questions, I call Assembly Member Hirani.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the panellists for giving your time today as well. I'm going to start the first question actually directed to Katherine, because there's a particular point that you mentioned on child poverty around inflation and the fact that families are spending 27% more per week on items that they were before. What impact have the recent rises in inflation and cost of living had on levels of child poverty in London?
So I don't know if we're going to come on and talk about the figures in more detail, but I think the key thing to note is that the headline figures that we have from the government don't necessarily reflect currently. What the impact has been, I think. We've actually seen a slight decrease in the headline figure of child poverty. It now sits at 33% in the latest data. But there is a significant lag on that data. It's from 21-22 and covers a period where there was additional social security protection in place through the £20 uplift, and doesn't cover the real full force of the impact of inflation. So I think I would caution that I think the figures don't tell us the whole story. I think we're far better listening to people like Chris, who's seeing the impact in real time with people coming through the doors of the food bank and the pantry. That we know people are really, really struggling. There are myriad examples of, I just talked about the figures around teachers giving out dental products in schools. Everyone we speak to, we run a network of around 450 organisations who address poverty in different ways in London. Lots of them are very small charities providing services in their communities, youth services, playgroups, drop-ins, advice centres, and they all, to a person, say that increasingly, on top of what their usual day-to-day business, they are now finding themselves in a position of having to provide very basic goods to people, food, warm spaces and so on. So I think the figures tell us one thing. Those are still extremely high levels of poverty, and we can dig more into the kind of reasons for those figures being as they are if members are interested. But I think the reality in front of us is very clear, and all the feedback I get from all the members in our organisation is that people are really, really struggling to make ends meet, and that is directly as a result of the cost of inflation. We all know that, but I think we all see that in our shop and when we buy anything. But I think the impact on those with the least to spare is
quite interested in your 27% figure, because the rate that's on the news in terms of inflation and the impact on families is more around the 10% mark. So would you say that how can you sort of explain the difference in that 27% versus what the sort of government advertised RPI inflation is?
Sure. Clara may be better placed in
Sure.
some of those figures as well. I suppose one of the things is that obviously it's kind of lots of goods. Food is the reason it's very high for families on low income is that they spend a much higher proportion of their budget on goods like food, for which the inflation rate is higher. And for some of the reasons that Clara sort of began to speak about as well, about the poverty premium, often people living on the lowest incomes aren't able to buy in bulk, travel to the places where they can access the cheapest goods. They're often on prepayment meters, so their energy costs. So I think cumulatively there are lots of reasons why they're facing higher costs and higher increase in costs than the general population.
Chris, do you want to come in on this point on inflation?
Yeah, what we see is that people make choices on the food that they're buying, and the cheapest food is the most unhealthy food. So this also has an impact on people's health. So people are not choosing the foods that they are better, so things like the fruit and vegetables, which are going up significantly in price. which means that children's health is getting worse. The parents' health is also getting worse. We will see more issues within the NHS around obesity because of it, because of the choices of food. People have to make choices with their money. And when the money is less in value, you're looking at the essentials. If you look at a family and the choices they have to make, they look at some of the items that have gone up in value, things like, garden trampolines have gone up quite a lot in price. That's totally irrelevant if you're living in a flat. What you're trying to do is find the money so you can get through that next day. And it's those essential items that have gone up disproportionately.
Clara, did you want to come in?
I think the other way of looking at the sort of the drop in the poverty rate is what happens in the housing context, because of course we've heard and talked about poverty being defined by the cost of housing. Now the question is what happens when we actually look at housing. And one thing that we looked at was the proportion of people who live in the private rented sector. A lot of people in poverty live in the private rented sector, and a lot of those who were in poverty in the private rented sector, the rate was the lowest again over the last decade. So the question is sort of what's happening there. And one of our hypotheses and one of our concerns is that what we are actually seeing is low-income Londoners being pushed outside of London. And of course that would then skew the overall data. And the reason, why do we think this? Well, first of all, how can we see a reduction in poverty rate in the private rented sector, but actually rents are skyrocketing? So that there seems to be something off. And one of the answers could be that people are being pushed out. And it's always been a typical thing. If people are being pushed out to the outskirts of a city as costs go up, as rents become more expensive. And there's some data for the southeast that adds some credence to the theory. And in 2021-22, we have seen a rise of 400,000 within the bottom 40 of the population in terms of income. Again, this is a hypothesis. We don't have any conclusive proof of evidence, and I think what we would really need to be looking at is what the next 12 months data will tell us. So I would be, we would be very cautious before we start celebrating any sort of drops until we know what's causing it and what the longer term trend is.
Thank you. I think you've all alluded to the data showing that there's been a decrease according to the figures published up until 2021-22, and you all seem to be suggesting that actually it's the next set of data that should tell us the real picture or a better picture. Do any of the panelists have any information on when that next data set will be published? Maybe Debbie, do you have details on when we can expect the next set of figures? Tom's got his hand up.
It comes up end of March, so March 2024.
Okay.
Although I would say that these figures too won't be great because, I don't want to spend too much time, but basically for regions you need a 3-year average, but because of COVID, the 2021 data isn't deemed good enough. So next year you'll get a 2-year average of 2021 and 22 and 23, but that will still be sort of a bit variable because ideally you need a 3 years worth. But it will give a better picture, yes. And then could I come back to your previous point?
Yeah,
just quickly,
sure.
yeah. So just CPAG's own analysis finds that, it can get a bit confusing with all the inflation figures and falling inflation, but that still means rising prices. So I think it can be instructive to look at sort of how things have changed since pre-COVID. And so since pre-COVID, so sort of, and this is to do with the kind of the uprating kind of debate. So we find that next year the kind of the prices are forecast to be 25% higher than pre-COVID, and that's for the population as a whole. But then, as we've heard, the kind of low-income families spend more on food and energy as a proportion of their budget, so that's going to be even higher. Even even higher for those low-income families, and whereas benefits have only risen by 16% over that time. So and so kind of the debate around uprating, freezing it would be catastrophic, as you have this massive gap, and even increasing by the sort of September CPI, so 6 or 7%, it's not generous. It's kind of it still means that there's kind of real-term cuts over time, and I think also just to kind of, it is a cost of living crisis, and I don't want to devalue that, but we saw in the 2010s that sort of the kind of the amount taken out of social security and rising child poverty. I mean, so even if child poverty has fallen in London compared to pre-COVID, it was ridiculously high pre-COVID. So I think you have to look at the longer term as opposed to just the year-on-year fluctuations, I think.
And you mentioned sort of 2010, so data shows that child poverty rates decreased rapidly between 1998 and 2010 in this country. What would you say the reasons for that are?
So I think it helps to split it into 3 parts, actually. So the first part was there was massive investment in social security from 2000 to 2005. Also tax credits were introduced, and then benefits were consistently. So although the economy was booming, it wasn't just increasing benefits by inflation. Where benefits going kind of up by over and above the inflation and more economic growth, and this led to declining child poverty. And then actually, it's not as simple as just Labour were great and and then the Tories were bad, because Labour stopped doing this pre-recession in about 2005, and so you'll see actually the curve goes up because they stopped investing in social security, and then we had a subsequent fall because of the recession, which cut median income. So I think it shows that you've got a a good thing about relative poverty is that it takes the wider context into consideration. So when the economy is booming, there is more to spend, but I think what Labour did was they went out their way to spend over and above in those initial years in order to reduce child poverty.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Boff, you wanted to come in.
Thank you. The government, of course, increased the national living wage by 9.7% and benefits by 10% in April. How has that contributed to resolving some of the problems that people in poverty have had?
Who are you asking, Assemblymember Boff?
It's a very good question. I'm asking anybody who wants to give an answer.
I'm happy to answer that. So I think, I think it helps with the wider picture because we have the lag on inflation and uprating. So I think so 10%, it was helpful, and kind of part of the 16% rise up in benefits since pre-COVID, but prices have risen by 25%. So I think so everything's getting scaled up, but benefits kind of not by quite as much. But I think it was in a time of hard choices, I think you've got to give the government some credit for doing that, as opposed to a lower rate. And also things like uprating the benefit cap definitely helped with those level of deep poverty in London, and then the living wage too. That's that makes a difference to low pay. Although I would say for it's definitely kind of one piece of the puzzle, but a key issue for child poverty in particular is the number of hours that families can work. So it's not like everyone in poverty is working minimum wage jobs, and as you go up, it gets higher. It's more an issue of the hours and the childcare for child poverty. So definitely commendable to do it, but I think you've got to look at the wider barriers which can influence why there's so high levels of in-work poverty for child poverty.
Thank you. I wonder if I could just come in there as well and ask a question. Perhaps either Tom or Katherine might want to answer this. So, as Assembly Member Boff has quite rightly said, the benefits did rise in April. The announcement for that was made in the November budget last year, and there was a 5-month lag before that happened. I wonder if anybody could actually tell us what was happening to people in those 5 months. Katherine, would you like to?
I mean, I think there was a great deal of uncertainty about whether benefits would be uprated. A lot of toing and froing and rumour and counter rumour about whether that would happen. That obviously creates a great deal of anxiety. I think it is deeply problematic that benefits are only uprated on an annual basis when we're looking at inflation rates that have changed so significantly. Does make it very difficult, I think, for people to plan and understand, and puts them into even greater levels of hardship in those sort of intervening periods when prices have risen and there's a lag before benefits will follow. I think that's true of a lot of mechanisms. I think the Resolution Foundation's report on their setting of the London living wage for the year we're currently in shows that there's so much uncertainty to balance in setting those rates about what future inflation will be, about government's decisions, policy decisions around benefit rates and so on. Coming to those figures is very difficult, and whether we ought to have more flexible, responsive mechanisms for setting these sort of rates that people rely on so greatly is a good question, I think.
Thank you very much. Chris, did you want to add to that? Because you would have been actually working absolutely during that period.
Yeah, we saw that period was continued to be a struggle for people. What we do know with universal credit as well is that 45% of people on universal credit are in debt and having to repay loans as well. When people are coming to a food bank, that figure rises to 57%. So an increase of 10% actually is also taken up with a debt repayment at the same time. So there is a real problem around the benefit system that people are not getting enough money. So a 10% rise, it's good. No one's arguing it's not good. Is it enough? What we did see during the COVID period as well is when the extra £20 a week was given to people on benefits as well during that time, we saw our referrals drop at that point. And when that got scrapped, we saw our referrals go up again. So we know that actually if you increase benefits to the right amount, then actually people start to have the cash to resolve situations rather than having to rely on charities like us.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to talk about the specific demographics that have been impacted by poverty rates in London specifically. So Tom and Clara, perhaps you'll be able to answer this, but could you give us an example of which particular demographics have been impacted by the high levels of poverty and what the reasons are for that?
So overall, in London, as you mentioned, there is a variation in terms of communities that are more impacted. It's minoritized communities, disabled Londoners, and the single-parent households that tend to be most affected. So, for example, for black and minoritized communities, the rate is 33% and 47% of single-parent households. So that gives you a flavor of that. I think the other community that it's important to mention, of course, there are loads of Londoners who are born outside of the UK, and some of those families have no recourse to public funds, and there'll be children in those. And I think that's an important factor, in particular in London to think about.
Yeah, so I think those things, definitely, I mean, I agree with everything that Clara said. I think and renters too, kind of, they have, they often kind of, they're more likely to be in poverty in London, and then so I think these groups in general are more likely to sort of be in poverty kind of across the country, but then in London there is a higher sort of concentration of these sort of minority groups, and then two policies which I mentioned earlier, the two-child limit and the benefit cap. So the two-child limit is it's highest in sort of the areas where there's sort of highest amounts of ethnic minorities, which sort of generally have larger families, and then also the benefit cap. It disproportionately affects Londoners. It affects renters. I think the sort of 90% of households with children, a very high share of those, single parents. So it's all kind of it all adds up to sort of mean that these families are even worse affected in London.
So, I mean, when I'm looking at our own figures here, it looks like that Tower Hamlets, and specifically, is a main area of concern when it comes to poverty, black and minority ethnic groups, particularly Bangladeshi and Pakistani households. I'm quite interested to know why that is the case, particularly with that ethnic group, and if you can just kind of just explain why that particular group is impacted by poverty.
So I think it's sort of it's hard. They are sort of. I don't think there's there's small sample sizes, so I wouldn't say that they're sort of. I wouldn't say, especially in London, that they're sort of they're faring much worse than other ethnic minorities. But slightly higher concentration. But I think so they have kind of. Culturally, having larger families means you're more likely to be affected by the benefit cap and the two-child limit. And then I think, for child poverty everywhere, you generally need at least kind of like a second earner to be working part-time in a couple. And I think there's a cultural the rates of labour force participation by the second earners, who are traditionally the women, are very low, and that means it's very hard to get sort of enough income to sort of, especially when the families are larger, in order to kind of escape poverty.
So, I mean, I'm just going to ask a question for the panel. I mean, do you agree then, because you've just mentioned the two-child benefit cap, if we were to remove that would actually have a positive impact in terms of that particular demographic? Chris, you've got your hand up, yeah.
I talked to one of our advice workers yesterday, and she said about a family that she's supporting at the moment who have got 3 children. Pre-COVID, she was working after 2017, they had a child, their 3rd child. During COVID, she became ill. She has not been able to work since then. We have helped them to get all the benefits they can, but what the parent has said is, I'm trying to bring up 3 children on the money of 2 children. And she was doing everything right. Beforehand, not needing benefits, suddenly became ill during COVID, has not been able to work since, and is hit by this. And they've gone from being a working family to a family who can't work and are now struggling to survive. And it is totally that policy that's been the problem.
It's significant that one policy can make that much of difference. Katherine?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to just really endorse that. If there was one thing that national government could do to reduce the number of child poverty in London overnight, it would be to end the two-child limit. So I think, it's very clear in the figures. I mean, nationally, among non-working families, the national figures are 75% of families with more than 2 children living in poverty. So those are really very high rates. And as we know, they will affect certain groups in London particularly. I just want to make a different point, which I don't think has been covered yet, is that something that's really come up very strongly about within our discussions in the network this year is the impact of poverty on families with a disabled child. So while the rates themselves are not significant, they are higher, definitely. I mean, it's 35% of children with a disabled child experiencing poverty. I think there's more work to be done and thought about the depth of the poverty that they face. I mean, significant additional costs associated with raising a disabled child. We took a delegation of mums from different parts of London to Parliament yesterday to meet their MPs to talk about this, and they were talking about huge numbers of issues, areas where they face additional costs. food for their child, transport, needing to keep the heating on, really facing very severe levels of hardship, those families. And I would want the committee to really kind of pay attention to their experiences at the moment, because they also interact with other difficulties they face in accessing services as well. So they face income poverty, but they also face difficulties accessing services that would alleviate some of those stress and worries, whether they be health services or education as well. So I think the experience of those families is particularly troublesome.
There's definitely a clear correlation between a family with a disabled child linked to poverty. Would you say the same for special educational needs as well?
Again, it will depend the special educational need, but I mean, I don't have figures, but there was a mum yesterday talking about very often her child is in a situation where because the school isn't able to meet their needs, they are exhibiting challenging behaviour, which is very difficult for the school to manage, and they're frequently out of school or being called into school, making it impossible in a relatively low-wage job where there's not a lot of leeway for that parent to take time out constantly and placing their work at risk. So lots of ways, yeah. It wouldn't be for every child with special educational needs, but certainly a lot of them, yeah.
I do want to talk a little bit about the variation of child poverty rates in different parts of London. And again, when we're looking through the research that we've been given, it's pretty scattered. It's not just inner London. I know there is a difference between inner and outer London, but it is pretty much everywhere. And that's interesting in itself. But why is there are pockets of poverty all over London? What's happening in those particular areas to make such a significant impact on poverty levels in those areas? Perhaps Clara, Katherine, you could answer that.
Yeah, there is a lot of variation across London, and there could be you can overlay it with again with all of these things that we talked about with housing costs. You can overlay it with general deprivation data, but if you look at it, actually there is poverty pretty much everywhere in London. So I think what we need to be very careful about is to say, well, this is in statistical terms, a rich borough, therefore there isn't an issue with poverty. But then actually when you go into the particular borough, you will have pockets of deprivation. And again, those people will face much higher costs, because if you look at the opportunity around, where you can shop and affordability and availability of services, they will be reduced. So I think while data overall is helpful, I think it's really important to understand what's the local context and potentially the local solution. So I think we need to really take that into account, and also thinking about what are the local labour market opportunities, because again, London doesn't have one single labour market. It's a collection often of local labour markets, and the opportunity to earn a decent income but also have a secure income will vary depending on a particular location. So I would say sort of figures are helpful, but we need to go deeper and understand what the situation is on the ground and locally. And I think organizations like Chris's organizations will be able to sort of feel what is happening on the ground and actually
I appreciate
understand.
that. I mean, I think we have to be very careful with the data that we get. I mean, as a primary school teacher myself, I was working in Kingston and Richmond, which are considered to be not on the poverty levels. But the school that I was working in, you'd be shocked at the kind of level of poverty that I was seeing. Incredibly high rates of poverty within those schools. So there are definitely pockets of poverty within every borough and every part of London that we need to be very aware of. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, Assembly Member Boff.
We've seen a rather massive increase in support from the government with regard to funding for special educational needs, and I just wondered what effect that is going to have. That's I mean, of the £3.5 billion package that the government has put in from March 2023, almost £1 billion of that is going to go towards high needs, and there's also a plan to invest £2.5 billion to fund new places and improve existing provision for young people with special educational needs. for alternate provision. That's a huge increase on top of possibly on top of 1.5 billion and 780 million for high needs funding. Is that going to have an effect?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's relatively recent commitment, and very welcome that there will be additional expenditure. I mean, certainly wasn't the parents I was speaking to yesterday. It certainly hadn't filtered through yet. I think this isn't my area of expertise. We could certainly refer to other members that can provide you with more detail after the meeting. But I think. Certainly the need is growing as well. I think the numbers of children receiving a diagnosis of special educational needs or a disability is increasing enormously. So I think as to whether the money is enough, I think it has to be looked at, measured against about the number of children, and also I think the fact that money is often spent at the moment at in the wrong places, so it's not getting to children early enough as early intervention, particularly in the educational settings where they can benefit from it most and go on to thrive and receive the full benefit of their education. Too often it's about children who've ended up out of mainstream school for all the wrong reasons and then being placed into very expensive settings to address those things. So I think it's about more money, and it's also about spending the money more wisely as well.
Thank you. We are going to take a short adjournment, but whilst, just for interest for panellists and for members of this committee, whilst we've been here this morning, the Department of Work and Pensions have just released the figures for universal credit claimants in London, and sadly they have gone up to almost 1 million claimants now, and shockingly almost 40% of those claimants are in work. And we've spoken, and panellists have mentioned the issue of low pay. It is something that is very clear and a very endemic issue. So that was breaking news. That's just happened. What we will do now is take an adjournment for 10 minutes, and if we could meet back here at 3 minutes past 11, please. Sorry, both my voice going and forgetting to set the microphone. Shall I do it again? There you go. Welcome everyone, and thank you for returning so promptly. Moving on to our next set of questions, Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you, Chair. I want to return to a subject that's come up a few times in answers, but I just want to make sure that everyone's had a chance to cover everything they want to cover in it, which is around policy at national level. So we've touched on the two-child benefit cap. We've touched upon national living wage. There may be more things to say about that, those issues. But so, what are the main policy changes at a national level that would help alleviate child poverty in London? Does anyone want to come in so I don't have to pick on anyone? Thanks, Katherine.
I think you're right. I think we have covered some of the really key ones, but just to reiterate, removing the two-child limit, addressing the wider issue of adequacy of benefits, and we would certainly support the call for an essentials guarantee to ensure that benefits can meet the bare minimum, but as a first step to something beyond that as well. We support CPAG's call for increasing child benefit, and we'd also looking beyond the boundaries of this city and beyond the next school year to thinking about expanding the eligibility for free school meals as a permanent measure for all children across the UK. I suppose the other things that lie very clearly in central government's hands, the one I would highlight most is around childcare funding. I know this committee has looked in detail at childcare funding and the childcare situation in the city before. So again, we could have another whole session on that. But I do think we are For Intent is a member of the new Early Years and Childcare Coalition that has been set up to develop a full policy platform about what we would be calling for in terms of childcare changes to childcare entitlements. We know that all political parties are looking in detail at this at the moment, and various commitments have been made and will be made. I think for us as a child poverty organisation, and hopefully for you as a committee looking at this, you would want to be clear that the entitlements that are increased, whether that be in terms of increasing the number of hours available to families at a subsidised rate or to a greater age range of children, that it's those on the lowest incomes that are able to benefit from those the most. I think it's sort of a progressive universalism concept, I suppose, because I think at the moment there is a danger, particularly given the complicated state of the childcare market and the very precarious state that a lot of nurseries find themselves in, simply pouring more money in at the top and giving families entitlements to more hours will not result in what policymakers hope that it will in terms of people getting more childcare. It will be very difficult for the sector to deliver, and therefore there will still be a need for top-ups and additional fees, and as well as the fact that the entitlements have become very strongly linked to work, so that families who are out of work, whose children are experiencing poverty and would gain an awful lot from accessing childcare, are frozen out entirely of the entitlements at the system at the moment. So I think whatever plan is come up with and whatever plan is implemented, we need to be looking at really carefully from the perspective of London's poorest children and trying to ensure that it will benefit them by that yardstick. There are other things I think that both the GLA and local authorities can be doing on that, but that's not your question for now.
It isn't, and I am almost certain that we will come to that later. So yes, if we just stick on national, then we'll move on. Thanks very much. Tom, did you want to come in next? Thanks.
Yes, I would agree with. I agree with everything that's just been said. I just want to a slightly separate but related issue. I think employment support is something that employment support reform is something that should be looked at. I mean, crudely speaking, there should be less stick, more carrot. So there's no real evidence that sanctions work. They just worsen mental health and create this a culture where people are fear going to the job centre or and instead CPAG have a project which works with potential second earners and couples, which is as previously mentioned, important for child poverty, where we sort of provide more personalised sort of employment support, have a small pot of funding for sort of training courses, or those are kind of initial expenses while you're sort of training, looking for a job. And we found that was it led to many clients sort of getting well-paid, meaningful jobs, as opposed to just getting those kind of low-paid, precarious, low hours, no chance of career progression jobs. Instead, if you take kind of, it's not taking sort of years and tens of thousands of pounds. It's just a kind of a small amount to retrain in a career and sort of a bit of kind of initial upfront funding, a bit of support, and then these people are finding jobs and they're sort of moving off benefits, they're paying more taxes, and it's a kind of, if anything, a revenue boosting sort of intervention. And then there's also stuff, the interaction with the kind of benefit systems. So we would call for a second work allowance, universal credit. So just briefly for those who don't know, so in universal credit, for the first earner, they get to earn a certain amount before their benefits get tapered away, and this is good for kind of getting people into the labour market and sort of giving them a bit of income before they sort of start to lose their benefits as they earn more. But for second earners, there isn't. There's nothing in place, and so it means that sort of it's 55p is lost from the first pound of every earned, and then when you start paying national insurance contributions and start paying income tax, it goes down to sort of 30p for every pound earned, and then there's childcare on top of that, and so you're really getting down to sort of basically nothing, especially once you factor in other costs around work such as travel. So I think that is sort of an area which is ripe for reform. And then one more thing, just deductions on universal credit. So kind of at the very least, so kind of deductions are taken off for a variety of reasons, including advances to cover the 5-week wait, as well as sort of historic debts. And at the very least, kind of a cost-neutral thing would be to sort of spread out these deductions over a longer period of time. As at the moment, it's quite stringent, so people are sort of having to pay back these debts sort of in a short period of time, and that means they're losing sort of they're losing from what's already kind of an inadequate entitlement, and this is sort of pushing families deeper into poverty.
Thanks very much. Clara, did you want to come in?
I agree with everything that was said. I think one point I would add is around really thinking very carefully before introducing any new cuts or sanctions that would in particular impact those who are disabled and long-term sick. There is a lot in the debate now, and we've heard the example that Chris was talking about somebody who has become long-term ill or unable to work and disabled, and it's the wrong way to do this policy, to be more punitive and to decrease incomes and send people into poverty or into more deep poverty, especially given what we know about the already disadvantaged position of those disabled Londoners and them being more likely in poverty. And of course, Katherine was talking about also disabled children. So I think it's important to look at all of these policies and how they interact, because it's not one single policy, it's the package that will actually do it. So I think we shouldn't be sort of giving with one hand and then taking with the other hand. So I think that's where the data becomes very important for us to understand the impact.
Thanks, Clara. That's really helpful. Chris, did you have anything to add on that? Sorry, I'm being really quiet.
Yeah, that's okay, thank you. I think to put dignity at the front of the policies when we're looking at everything around universal credit, how are people going to survive here? Pecan, as a charity, we were, when I joined 12 years ago, we were 95% an employment support charity, helping people to move up from there, and about 5% as a food bank. We are now 9% as an employment charity and 51% as a food bank. We also run women's services on top of that as well. And that means actually what we're doing is we're just helping people to survive, because that's the situation people are in. And going along to a food bank actually denies people dignity. It also means that we're replicating what Tesco's and the supermarkets are doing by getting food ready. But the worst thing is we're choosing it for them and giving it to them. If people had the money, they would go to the local shops, they would go to the supermarkets, they would actually put the money they're getting back into the economy. At the moment, they're not doing it. They're coming along to charities who are giving out food for free, which means the economy is failing because universal credit is failing people.
Thanks. Thank you. That's really important. I just want to ask about a specific potential intervention, which is around legislation. So the last Labour government, 2010, introduced a Child Poverty Act that had very specific targets set down in law, and I think Save the Children and the Mayor of London have expressed interest in that being reinstated or something new coming in. Do you think that would be helpful?
Yeah, yes, that would definitely be helpful. It's something that sort of the CPAG kind of has long called for, and we've seen. Well, we can see recently in Scotland the impact this has had. So kind of introducing their sort of Child Poverty Act with targets, and it has, like, I think with kind of COVID and everything that has come along, I think it would have been. I think without these targets, it would have been very easy for just sort of, well, we'll park that for another day. But it's meant that sort of it's committed the Scottish Government to introducing the Scottish Child Payment, as well as kind of as well as a raft of other policies which sort of which mean that sort of there's forecast to be a historic reduction in child poverty this year, as that's when the sort of main policy has been rolled out. And I think there are sort of wider benefits of having the child poverty kind of having the child poverty strategy too, because it means that sort of all departments sort of have to kind of think about child poverty, be it health, be it education, whereas which we definitely hear from sort of our work with the kind of education sector. There's a growing sort of belief that sort of child poverty is one of, if not the most important issues. But I think sort of having that sort of kind of in the sort of frameworks that the sort of DFE and other sectors of the government sort of work with, having that more enshrined would be sort of beneficial to seeing kind of reductions in both the level, the depth, and also the kind of the impact that child poverty has.
Many thanks, and apologies for not giving CPAG the credit for their position already. Does anyone else want to add anything to that? No, that's fine. Everyone agrees. That's great. Going on to something that Katherine mentioned earlier on, I think I'll come back to Chris first, which is, what do you think the most successful actions that local authorities and civil society groups are taking to address child poverty in London? And is there more that the Mayor could do to support these initiatives?
I'll make an absolute plug for a project that we run. We run Pecan Pantry, which is a very different way of people accessing food. It is totally based on dignity and choice. People will come in, they will choose food, they'll pay £4.50 as a base rate of food. And they go away with nearly £30 worth of food every time. The dignity in there of the choice is amazing, and there are a number of these now around the country. There are local authorities in London and outside of London who are rolling these out as a positive alternative for people to make their choice. We have an evaluation programme that goes alongside, and the households who have used the pantry the most have said that they are less affected by the cost of living crisis than people who used it a lot less. So we know that interventions like that work. And local authorities can come together and look at, dignity first options on how they can support people during this time until we come out of the crisis.
Thank you, and that's a really, really important point around dignity, and thank you for making it. Does anyone have anything? Katherine, did you want to have...
I'll be as brief as possible. I think there are definitely ways that local authorities can support families experiencing poverty. We have a kind of quite a large list of those, but just to kind of highlight some, I think we particularly interested in things like council tax support, which sits within the purview of local authorities. How local authorities design those schemes really matters, how generous they are, who can apply for them. Council tax support is a very direct way of putting money back into people's pockets that doesn't involve national government policy. It is money well spent for those local authorities because of all the issues we talked about in terms of the impact of child poverty, and it's very often local authorities that need to pick up the costs of the impact of detrimental impacts of child poverty. So we would really and do urge local authorities to look at those schemes. The schemes vary a lot around London. We've seen, in response to the ever-tightening budgets of local authorities, councils looking to their council tax support schemes to make them less generous as a way of saving money. We would definitely say it isn't a way of saving money, and we would laud those councils who found ways, despite the difficulties, to increase their generosity. I think that's the sort of area where the GLA can support more, to kind of be looking at the situation, looking at that variation, helping to spread best practice, as I know London councils do too. Similar issues around local welfare assistance as well. In terms of the voluntary sector, I think we perhaps fulfill a bit of a similar role to the one that I was suggesting the GLA could do in terms of spreading best practice. So Chris's organisation, Chris has just described a really excellent way of providing addressing food insecurity while preserving people's dignity. We know that an awful lot of voluntary organisations find themselves in the position of having to do that without having that depth of experience or knowing how to do it. There are lots of good examples. Little Village, who provide baby banks across London, would be another really good example. That the way they provide families with very young children with material support in a way that is dignified by encouraging them to come into their shops, as it were, and choose things like anyone who's having a new baby would want to do. So we will try and spread that best practice around, amplify it, make sure that others who are approaching these issues for the first time will be able to sort of gain from that experience as well. So yeah, there's lots of good practice to be spread around.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Clara, did you want to come in? Thank you.
And another initiative to throw into the mix is the living wage campaign and the work around living wage. Of course, the difference between London living wage and the national living wage is £1.05, and there is a role for it's a civil society campaign that started not far from here, but there is a big role for local authorities, and there is a number of boroughs in London who are accredited living wage, and I think what we would want to see is more of those, because that of course then impacts on procurement decisions and that impacts on local jobs. So that is a very, very significant potential impact that can create an immediate uplift. And it's not just the living wage, but it's also the added standard to it, and that's living hours, which is not talked about as much, but that's dealing with the job insecurity that I think Tob was mentioning. It's guaranteeing minimum hours, it's guaranteeing more advance notice around shifts and around termination of employment. So it gives people the possibility, even if you are not on a very low wage, if you are in an insecure job and you cannot plan for the future, for example around childcare, you again will earn less or will have to pay more for a lot of things. So I think living wage and living hours is one of the things that local authorities can do to commit to themselves, but also promote to businesses in their local area to put more money into people's pockets.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much. And back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Baker. Assembly Member Boff.
Ms Hill, you've rightly said that there are a lot of local authority initiatives for reducing the costs for those people in poverty. Of course, a lot of those people in poverty are dependent upon cars. Do you think that it might be a useful thing to allow the poorest to not have to pay £12.50 a day for getting into what may be a very low-paid job?
This isn't something that we have a particular position on. I think transport costs are a significant issue for people living in poverty in London in lots of ways. I think many of the families that we are in contact with through our members probably don't have cars. They live, they wouldn't have the funds to support that.
A significant number do.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we would certainly want to see costs reduced, and obviously those need to be balanced against other policy priorities as well. I think the young people who are addressing the summit today, I know are particularly interested in around the cost of public transport for older young people, particularly who are sort of still accessing education and training beyond the statutory school age and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot that can be done in that space. To make transport more accessible for people to be able to access work. One part of that is the cost of the charge, but it needs to be considered as part of the whole picture.
Sure.
Assembly Member Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start with Clara, and probably Chris might want to come in as well, and everybody else afterwards. It strikes me that there's very few things the government can do that won't add to the deficit, because we are talking about supporting changes in benefits without looking at the wider reality that the government has to cover. The one thing they could do, in my mind, is a very steep rise in living wage, London wage, whatever you want to call it, a very steep rise, because the burden would fall elsewhere. Do you think that's correct? And what do you think might be the impact? And not only on people who are living in poverty, of course, getting a rise in your salary would be great, but what impact would it have on employment and the wider economy?
Well, having a living wage calculated on living costs, as the real living wage is, would be a great way forward, because it sort of reflects the needs and the rising costs. I think, interestingly, talking about the cost for employers of employing living wage, last year we have seen one of the highest raises in the real living wage taking London living wage as an example. It was almost a 10% hike. And I know that the Living Wage Foundation was concerned about what is going to happen with those accredited. Will there be a sharp drop-off? Will businesses no longer be able to afford it? And the sharp drop-off did not occur. And I think that is a testament of actually being a good employer, and there's various types of research on it, is good for business. It's good for retention, it's good for productivity. It also is more attractive for business-to-business relationship for investors. A lot of investors are now looking at how businesses are behaving on the social side, not just around profits. So that is one thing. And the other thing is as well, the attractiveness of living wage for those who can pay more is an interesting aspect as well. Lots of times there is an argument, for example, you hear it from the supermarkets, but also in the hospitality industry, well, we can't pass it on to the customers. People would not pay more. And there was a recent poll that was done specifically in relation to the hospitality industry in London that has actually shown the opposite, that people who can afford to pay more would be willing to pay more if the restaurant or the hotel they had stayed in would be guaranteeing decent wages to people. So I think that there is compelling evidence to show that actually paying people more is not just good for the employees, but it's a good investment in terms of business. And just a final point, there was a study around this in the US during the height of the pandemic in terms of businesses that were more resilient to shocks like this. And again, businesses that had good employment practices proved to be more resilient. So from a business perspective, it seems to make sense rather than the race to the bottom and often the low-wage economies that we have seen in this country quite a lot.
Okay. Chris?
Thank you. I think when we're looking at the deficit, we are in a deficit now, that is right. But then we look at the people who are out of work, the people on low incomes as well. They're also in a deficit. And who is actually supporting them during this time of deficit? It's actually the charities. And charities like mine, during this time, we have made a decision to use our reserves so that we can continue to support people. So we're not breaking even. We know these 3 years since COVID, we're not going to break even. So actually, where the government is looking to reduce the deficit, where's that money going to come from? It's coming from the voluntary sector. It's coming from the individuals. What we need is policies that look at how do we move people from struggling to survive to be able to use the voluntary sector and the skills that we have across the voluntary sector to help people move towards thriving so that they're inputting back into the community. So if we can think of it that way round instead, then actually we get to move people on, we get to reduce the mental health crisis that is coming because of this as well. So it really is, let's invest in people. That's the real key thing.
Okay, thank you. Just two short questions, Chair. Earlier on, somebody talked about people being in debt, taking out loans. Is there any data around what they were taking those loans out on? Is it a day-to-day survival thing? Are they paying heating bills with that, or is it other things?
A lot of the people that we work with that are in debt to the government. So it's where they've had to get their universal credit brought forward, or that they've got their essential costs, so electricity, gas, trying to make sure they've got money to go on to their meters as well. It could be for food. If they've had a crisis, something's gone wrong at home, it could be that the cooker's gone, the microwave's gone, they have to replace it. That's something that they just can't do, so they go into further debt. Usually it's a debt to the government for, as we say, 57% of people coming through to food banks are in debt, and most of that debt is borrowing against the government.
Okay, and I suppose, Chris, my next question would be to you as well. Earlier we talked about food choices and people buying, the worst food being the cheapest food. Is there any evidence that people weren't buying that food beforehand? Because we live in obesity is not new to this country. We've been eating terribly for years and years and years and years. Is there any evidence that poverty has pushed people that way, or is it just a continuation of the trend?
It is about a choice thing, and for a lot of people, a chicken and chips is a great meal, and they like it. And we've seen the growth in fast foods because it's cheap food as well. So people have always tried to manage their budgets with that. What we're seeing is that increasing, and I've forgotten the guy's name. The guy who was Iceland's chief executive, who said, "I'm not losing business to our competitors. I'm losing business to food banks."
Interesting. And I just want to, earlier on we talked about a level, an income, a basic level of income that people need to survive. Do we have a figure for that in London? Is it £150 a week, £400 a week? Do we have a figure for that in London? Maybe I'll start with Katherine.
I can't give you a figure here and now. I can certainly look it up. I know the Joseph Rowntree Foundation do a lot of work on the minimum income guarantee, which does give those figures. I'm afraid I don't have it here, but I can certainly provide you with them after the session.
Okay, that through you, Chair, would be great, because what I'm trying to get to the bottom is a lot of this conversation is we are focused on London, we are focused on people, the government's focused on a bigger, wider thing. For instance, they spent $276 billion on the welfare system. It just strikes me, if they gave that money directly to poor people, wouldn't that be the answer? The question I think I'm asking is this money being spent appropriately, because the government is spending a lot of it?
I think it goes back to some of the things we set out at the outset around the causes and the drivers of poverty, and if we're thinking about London specifically. So we know that huge amount of that money is going straight through the housing benefit system to pay landlords and so on. So tackling the housing crisis would reduce that bill. So I think, for me, it's about thinking about these issues in the round and strategically about the whole of the spend and how we can get further upstream and reduce those costs for people and tackle some of those really significant drivers of poverty.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Bailey. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to go back to Assemblymember Baker's original question about the local authorities. And Katherine, you mentioned best practice. And I think this is such a key role for the Mayor. I'd like to bring Debbie into this. One of the things that Chris mentioned was mental health. And I know that a lot of local authorities are trying to bring in mental health practitioners, particularly in primary schools that I mentioned before that of my experience of that, and in the secondary schools. But also we haven't touched on this greatly, but also on children in care as well. They're greatly impacted on poverty. I know that Sutton Council have got an integrated service where they have a care team that support young people who are in care, but also just recently left care, because I think that's also a big factor here to making sure that they have support on housing, employment, and managing finance. Is there something that the Mayor's doing to make sure that he is promoting the good work that local councils are doing and making sure that best practice is shared?
Thanks for your question, Hina. So can I just clarify, is your question about whether or not he's promoting what local authorities are doing specifically on children in care, or just more broadly the work that they're doing? Okay, right, yes. So yes, through the London Partnership Board, which is meeting actually a bit later on this afternoon, we've been working very closely with councils across the city to ensure that we're trying to promote best practice, certainly when it comes to some of the issues that have been raised already by some of our experts with regards to welfare assistance. We know that there are welfare pots of money which are available to individuals on very low incomes, but what we don't know enough about is how that money is being given out to those who need it. And so we've been working very closely with London councils to conduct an evaluation to understand how local welfare assistance is given out, whether or not there are gaps in the way in which it's being distributed, the way it's being received, whether or not this can be improved. So we've been doing some of that work, certainly. I think your point around children in care is a really good one. I know that we have been seeking to do quite a bit of work as well as the work that I do around poverty reduction, I also, in my other hat, do a lot of work on immigration. We've been seeking to work certainly with local councils to ensure that they are giving out immigration advice to children who are in care, because we know that there is a massive gap in relation to young people, children and young people actually understanding whether or not they have secure or not insecure status. And often it comes to a point when they are seeking to apply for funds, perhaps if they want to go to university, or when they suddenly come into direct interaction with the state, as it were, that they realise that their status is actually insecure. So we've been working certainly with local councils in relation to support for children in care with regards to that. I do think that this is a really important area that we do need to do an awful lot more work on. Children in care are often the groups of children and young people for whom not enough attention is given. Their risk of poverty is high, their risk of insecure status is high, their risk of falling through the cracks is really high. So it's an area of work that we're seeking to do more on across City Hall. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, panel. Following Lord Baker's questioning, Lord Bailing's question, I just gave you a patient. He seemed to be creating a policy of a universal basic income, which isn't where I was expecting the revolution to come from. But Deputy Mayor, I know the Mayor's team met recently with Big Local, who a group of Londoners have been supporting in looking at UBI pilots. Can I just ask if anything came from those meetings and where you're up to with the basic income pilots?
Yes, so I probably will bring Dan in for this, because his team were the ones who met with the team in East Finchley. We are obviously monitoring with great interest the trial. We know that there have been a number of trials which have been taking place around UBI, and I know that there was a very positive conversation that was had with the team. I think one point to make before I hand over to Dan is that the Mayor is quite keen for a pilot to take place in London, but recognises that it would be incredibly costly, and would be seeking to work with government to ensure that we could fund something like this to see whether or not it would work. But as in relation to the outcome of that meeting, I'm just going to bring Dan in.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. We met with Grange Big Local. It was a helpful meeting. It was helpful to understand more about the pilot. It was actually quite helpful to understand the way that they had gone about sort of engaging to construct the pilot as well. Debbie's mentioned the point about the sort of the cost of actually supporting the pilot itself, but one of the things that we have done is help them to link into that sort of broader sort of funder community in London to understand sort of what other options there might be to potentially bring together sort of a coalition of partners who might be in a position to fund something, perhaps, developing the proposal further or getting to, progressing it.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much. Clara, earlier you were talking about, well, you've spoken at length actually about in-work poverty, and you also talked about how for businesses it actually benefits them to be paying people properly too. Can I just push a little bit more to ask about job security as well? How important is that in terms of the changing nature of employment to tackling child poverty?
You're talking about job insecurity or insecure working conditions?
Both. So how could tackling that also help tackle child poverty, and is there a correlation?
I think, insecure working conditions or job insecurity is a big part of not being or being resilient to shocks. And I think that's the key thing, is a number of people on the panel are talking about the lack of ability to plan, the lack of having a buffer if something comes along, a broken oven or a life event, somebody is ill for a period of time, they can't work. So I think that these are really important things to look at. I think there is a lot of talk about the levels of income. And I think you cannot talk about levels of pay without addressing the conditions. Those conditions being decent and part of it is secure. So I think it's absolutely important to see that. And what comes to it, I think hours is a key thing, regularity, so shift patterns. We talk about 0-hour contracts where you get a text message in the morning to tell you whether you're working or not. Well, how is that compatible with childcare? How is that compatible with managing a health condition? So having actually some regularity around it. So there's a lot of talk about flexibility, but the flip side of flexibility can be greater insecurity. And as well, if you are on shorter term contracts, sort of regular notices or knowing what your notice is, what notice you can give, but also what the employer has, can help people plan. And that that impacts on transport costs. If you know what your month is going to look like, you can buy a longer term ticket. If you have to instant purchase, that's a higher cost. Similarly with childcare, so that is a huge impact on families' income. So again, that's where the poverty premium comes in. If you can't afford to invest into the future, you have to pay now, which means you'll pay a higher price. So I think your point is absolutely spot on in terms of security and being the other part of the coin around income.
Thank you. And if I can stay with you, Clara, just talked about the principle of universality here. Of course, the Mayor has taken this up with universal free school meals. Could I ask what the impact of those free school meals has been, and what do you anticipate the impact being for the 2023-2024 year for the free school meals?
So the free school meals impact can be very clearly on families' costs. So if you don't have to pay for the meal, then you'll have more money to spend on in theory. I think it is a positive thing. However, it's not dealing with the underlying causes, and I think that's the whole point. It is dealing with the symptom. It is an alleviation alleviation policy, but it's not dealing with the underlying causes. And I think it's also the long-termity. We'll have it for a year. What happens next year? So I think what we need to be looking at again is there's immediate interventions that are important, welcome, and are felt today, but they're not dealing with the underlying causes. They are not dealing with the long-term uncertainty and the ability to create resilience. And I think that's a really, really, really important point. You can have families that are okay now, but one significant event can throw them into poverty.
Thank you. Katherine, Tom and Chris, I'd like to come to all of you on free school meals, and I'll start with Katherine.
I mean, I'd endorse what Clara said very much. I mean, I think, we know from speaking to, small organisations who speak to families, the enormous relief there is about feeling that this is not a cost that they have to meet. It's tangible, it's real, and it's made a tremendous difference to people's levels of anxiety, I think, as one less thing to worry about in finding the dinner money. So I think, it can only be welcomed, and I really commend the Mayor for his boldness in sort of laying down the gauntlet in this way to show that it can be done. Obviously, the questions about how it can continue to be done remain. I think there is quite a lot. We had a session yesterday looking at some of the detail of it. I think there's a lot in the detail that is very challenging in terms of the rollout and ensuring that can be done very quickly and effectively. I think there are potentially some wrinkles in terms of unintended consequences in terms of schools continuing to access pupil premium. If people don't need to register for free school meals, there can be a problem with them continuing to receive pupil premium for all the eligible pupils. So there's a lot in the policy to look into, but as a top line, I think it can only be welcomed and hopefully is a spur to go further and faster in this regard.
Universal free school meals is one of CPAG's kind of key priorities for the national level. And again, we'd like to commend the Mayor for kind of introducing a policy when we know that sort of the stringent budget cuts over the past few years. So to find the money for this is greatly appreciated. And so I think there's a few things here. So I think that sort of the means tested threshold is far too low. So we know that there's 900,000 children across England who miss out, and so here 180,000 in London. So 80,000 of these children in poverty will now get free school meals because of this rollout. And we know that from universal free school meals, we know that sort of the benefits sort of reduced stigma, increased sort of attention, sort of in classes, so good for development and learning. And then there's also sort of wider evidence from sort of free school meal programs overseas. So there was a rollout in Sweden, which happened a while ago, and they followed these people over time, and there was a staggered rollout, so they could do some clever econometric stuff, and they basically found that sort of even a year of free school meals led to significantly higher earnings in adulthood. So it's so it has an impact on on a variety of things, and I think the main thing for CPAG is sort of the education system is universal apart from this one part of the day, and then for some reason we means test that. It seems pointless.
It's really well put. Thank you, Chris.
I think it's absolutely brilliant that we've got it coming in London. I wish it was across the whole country as well at the same time. We've talked about the economics. It saves a family about £400 per child a year. So if you've got 2 children, that's a big thing. What also it does, it's the educational impact. Teaching a hungry child, even if you've got the best teacher in the world and you've got the best facilities in there, if that child is hungry, I don't know about you, how much do you retain when you're hungry? How much do you retain when you're not hungry? Children are, as they have in Sweden there, are going to do a lot better if they have the meals. And the dignity of not having your little yellow ticket and going to queue up in a separate queue to everyone else makes a massive difference, that you can go and sit with your friends. You can sit with who you want because you're all having the same food. So it helps the teachers, it helps the children, it helps the parents. It's going to be good for the country.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor, if I can turn to you on another subject now, the Mayor's Cost of Living Hub. Could I ask how many Londoners have used it and what the impact has been?
Yes, you can, and I will get to my... we have... Sorry, I don't have that data. I haven't got the data right in front of me. And I'm going to have to ask Dan to give me the data. I'm looking at the wrong page. I know that there have been around 300, well, just over 300,000 unique page views, but our target was to have 300,000 unique page views, and we have exceeded that by, I think, around 7,000 or 8,000. The reason that we've been able to do that is because we've done an awful lot of outreach work to try to draw traffic to the site. We've also, in recognition that it's principally about those who are able to use the internet, who feel digitally confident, who are able to go to the site and be able to access the information. In addition to that, we've also printed and distributed 110,000 leaflets to those individuals for whom accessing a website would be difficult because they're digitally excluded, and we've done that in conjunction with it's called Lottie, I think it's the London Office for Technology and Innovation, who have told us specifically where in London there are groups of individuals who find it difficult to access the internet, find it difficult to access technology, and would be described as digitally excluded. So we've tried to use the hub to the best of our ability, in recognition that not everyone will be able to access all of the information there, by making sure that those who can't are able to do so by providing sort of hard copies. And we've also worked really closely with a range of community-based organisations and organisations who provide support to those groups of individuals with protected characteristics who are more likely to be living in poverty. So we've worked with Inclusion London, for example, so that we're accessing and reaching out to deaf and disabled Londoners. We've worked with a range of community-based and faith organisations so that they can help us to drive those groups of individuals who we know would benefit from seeing the information on it to be able to access the information.
Thank you. You listed a few groups there, and we've heard about minority groups today, disabled people, people with experience of the care sector. I realise you can't list every single group ever, it would take a long time. But those groups for whom English is not their first language, is there any extra work being done to make sure they can access resources?
It's a really good point. So we do, I think we recognise across all of the services that we are providing via london.gov.uk that not everyone will be able to access it if they do have challenges with English. And so we are introducing a translation feature for the Cost of Living Hub, but also for everything that is promoted on london.gov.uk, which hopefully will enable those who speak a variety of different community languages to be able to access information and be able to have it translated so that they can benefit from all of the services that are on london.gov.uk as well as everyone else. We have specifically done this, though, for the Cost of Living Hub, because we know that those are the groups of individuals for whom poverty rates are the highest. So there is that feature that will be added.
It's really good to hear, thank you. Finally, Dan, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Just on the point around translations into community languages, yeah, as Debbie says, the hub, like the rest of london.gov.uk, now has that translation tool. One of the other things we did sort of relatively early on, we did have a sort of a small grant funding program for organisations that have digital tools that support specific groups. And some of those, essentially, we were able to just provide some, relatively small amounts of grant funding just to help them translate some of those resources into different community languages. There was reference earlier to the costs on households with disabled children. There's an organisation called Contact, which has a sort of an information hub on how to sort of access things like disability living allowance, which is a relevant benefit. And so, yeah, we were able to just help them to translate into languages including Somali, Polish, and others.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari, I know I've got you listed next. If you could bear with me just a second, because I think Assembly Member Boff wishes to ask about universal free school meals, and then I'd like to ask one on that, and then ask you, and you do as well. Right, well, in that case, if we could start with you, then you, and then me.
Great, thank you very much, Chair. Appreciate that. It is about free school meals. I was a teacher when the free school meals came in during the coalition government, and I know that it was a government-funded approach, a long-term approach, and it's still going on. And that's why I'm concerned that this is a very short term approach that, Clara, you've just said, for 1 year. I want to know, what impact is it going to have? And Chris, maybe you could say this, come in here. What impact is it going to have, having such a short-term approach that it's going to, at some point, come to a sudden end, that these free school meals haven't got funding for the long term? It isn't going to be forever. It is just for 1 year. What impact will that have on the families?
It will be such a shame if it is only 1 year. We need to look at how can we make sure that this, through future funding, becomes really quite key to what we're doing as we look through our education budgets as well of poverty. So we've got to look at where does this come from. But as this year goes through, we'll see what the effect of it is on families. And, if there is some research that's going alongside it, which I'm sure there is, that will be key in helping to drive decisions for the next year, and hopefully we will have that money back.
Debbie, I'm just quite curious to know how much work the Mayor of London has done to ensure that it is longer than a year, that we have government support as well, because quite frankly, he hasn't got the budget to do this continually long term, and it has to be a government approach really for this to be a success. So what kind of work has the Mayor done to work with the government to make sure that this is a long-term objective and that the government will be able to make sure that this happens and continues to happen? Because I don't think it's going to succeed without government support.
Yeah, so absolutely. So all of these points are very well made. We know that the Universal Free School Meals initiative is an emergency measure. We know that we were able to access funds largely because of additional funds that we received, which enabled us to be able to do this. But we do want this to be something which is available to all children continuously, so that it doesn't come to that sharp sort of cut-off point that everyone has mentioned. What we are hoping is that the rollout of universal free school meals across London and the success that it has and the impact that it has is something which will demonstrate that it's an initiative that needs to be picked up on a national level. We are continuously lobbying government about picking this up and trying to roll it out nationally, as we think that they should be doing. And we will continue to work with London councils, with the voluntary sector, with others to continuously raise the importance.
There's no guarantee, and I think that's the thing that's concerning for a lot of parents who are going through this. I mean, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was the funding. There's an allocated funding. The analysis that Schools Week has done has shown that there might be an estimated shortfall of £33 million across London. So how do you know if the Mayor's is seeking any way of reimbursing boroughs that are having to shoulder the shortfalls of the scheme?
I know that the fund has a contingency fund contained within it to enable us to try to work with councils who might be experiencing any barriers to rolling this out. And we are in constant conversation with all boroughs to ensure that they're able to overcome any difficulties that they or their schools might be experiencing in trying to deliver this for children. And that contingency fund includes support for boroughs, as well as recognising that there are particular communities for whom the £2.65 per meal per child allocation that the money is covering, that it takes into consideration that there are other dietary requirements related to faith that we might need to take into consideration. So kosher versus non-kosher meals, there is a difference in cost, and so we're using that contingency fund to try to address both that as well as any difficulties that boroughs are facing. But we are in constant conversation with boroughs. We want this to work for London boroughs. We know that it's something that schools and parents and children will benefit from, so we are continuing that dialogue.
I mean, it is an important policy, but I am worried about the fact that, it's been heavily promoted, but only for a year. We've got posters going up all over the tubes. We've got letters and emails going directly from the Mayor of London to parents about the Free School Meals Initiative. and yet it's only going to be for a year. And it's also at a time which is interesting that it's just before an election that this is happening. So there's going to be some cynicism towards this. I'm going to be frank. It is cynicism coming not just from political people like myself, but also from parents that saying, you know, what's the point here? If it isn't a government-funded approach, it's not going to be long-term. It gives, you know, there are parents who are going through really difficult, challenging times. To do this at a short approach is going to be damaging for a lot of families, and that is my main concern. You know, short-term policies like this seem political rather than actually really, making sure that there are long-term solutions to a big problem. Like Clara was mentioning, we need to think about the causes and not have short-term policies that just do a short-term fix and don't solve the problem.
So, I mean, I hear all of that, and I think there's a couple of things to say in answer. I think the first thing is that this was introduced in a clear recognition that we were going through a cost of living crisis, and it's a cost of living crisis that hasn't gone away, and which we know introducing something like this, which can have that impact of just reducing costs for families of £440 per child per year, can make a massive difference. The Universal Free School Meals initiative, however, is not being conducted in isolation. We're also running a range of initiatives which are specifically about addressing some of those drivers that we've been mentioning today. So trying to recognise that tackling poverty is as much about bringing down costs as it is about bringing in income. So we're doing an awful lot of initiatives around income maximisation and trying to develop cash-first principles that will enable those on the lowest incomes to just have cash in their pockets, which we know are some of the best ways of trying to tackle poverty. So recognised in here that there will be people who may have cynicism, but this is an initiative which has been developed with child's best interest at heart, absolutely, in a clear recognition that there are families who are experiencing real financial challenges right now. And anything that we can do that will enable us to try to bring down costs for families in any shape or form, I think is a good thing to be doing. So in answer to all of those questions, I think I'm glad that we have done this. What we really want to do, though, in clear recognition of everything that you've said, Hina, and others have said, is to try to ensure that when it comes to July, that this is not something that comes to an end, because child poverty isn't going to last for 1 year. We know that it will make that difference, but we are lobbying very heavily to work alongside others to try to ensure that we can just continue to do this for London.
Thank you. Just before we move to Assembly Member Boff, and before they go, could we say hello and assalamu alaikum to the Darul Uloom School from Bromley and the pupils who've come here to visit? Thank you very much. Assembly Member Boff.
Of course, the free meals policy doesn't address the needs of the most deprived. It's actually geared towards the less deprived and the not deprived at all, because that's where the funding is going, because as we all know, the support for the most deprived comes directly from government and is getting more generous every year. Has this universal policy now removed any need to target the most deprived children?
Sorry, is the question to anyone?
I think Miss Hill, perhaps.
I think the argument about targeting versus universalism is sort of as old as the hills, and is yet another sort of thing that we could debate at length. I think there is good evidence that universalism in relation to school meals means that the children who most need meals are getting it. We, in the webinar I referred to yesterday, were talking about uptake of free school meals, and actually it was focused on secondary school pupils, so where this doesn't apply currently in London, and talking about children who are should be in receipt of free school meals, but who simply don't take the meal, who don't get that meal for a whole myriad of reasons to do with the way that schools deliver free school meals currently. at secondary level, and to do with the stigma
This
attached
is not
to
a
it.
secondary
But the
level
principle
function
No.
measure, is it?
But the
It's
principle,
just primary.
The principle applies in exactly the same way. I'm just saying that that's what's currently happening in schools at the moment, which it isn't in primary. So I think there's a very real risk that if we only target through what is a very means test for free school meals at the moment, which discounts a lot of children who are experiencing poverty, then even those children aren't getting it. The benefit of universalism is that all children receive their free school meal and get to benefit from it.
The question was, does this remove the need then to focus on the most deprived in terms of their eating habits?
And I suppose I'm saying I think this is a better way of targeting the most deprived.
So we won't have to have any specific targeting for those who are most deprived anymore.
Specifically in relation to free school meals.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to ensure that those children are receiving them, and there are reasons why, for example, we were talking about disabled children. Not all disabled children are able to receive their free school meal because their dietary requirements.
Earlier you were saying that this progressive universalism, which I had to Google, to be honest, you were saying that that progressive universalism doesn't remove the need for extra support for those who are most deprived. Now you're saying actually this free school meals programme does remove the need for any extra support for those who are most deprived.
I don't think I fully understand, because if children are receiving a meal, they don't need another meal. I don't.
Well, are they eating the right meal? Do we need to focus on their? Do we need to focus on what meals they're getting at home? Do we need to do that kind of stuff? I mean, surely we should be focusing not just on the meal we're giving them, but also their entire diet.
Yeah, agreed. I certainly think in addressing food insecurity, free school meals is not the only answer.
Great, Mr. Price, you said to me about, you said earlier that these separate queues that kids had to join. Where are they?
Inside the school. Some schools. Well,
could you name some of those schools? I mean, I'd be delighted to hear, because I'll go around and give them a good kicking, because that hasn't happened in my knowledge for many, many years. And that those in receipt of free school meals, it's an invisible process. So I would be fascinated to find out if there are any schools operating that in London, because they should be ashamed of themselves if they have.
Sorry, Assemblymember Buff, if I remember correctly, Chris actually talked about a yellow ticket as opposed to separate queues.
Anything that distinguishes people in free school meals, and that should be invisible.
I'm sure that evidence could be provided. I was chairing an event last night about free school meals, and we had story after story of how that stigma was going to be there.
Nobody's ever named a school to me. I've been asking this question now for years, and nobody's ever come up with the name of a school where this actually happens. And I mean, I'll totally retract that question. I'll never ask it again. If you can come up with the name of a school. As far as I know, all the schools I know are responsible. They look after not just the welfare of their kids, but also what it's like to be separated out from the pack in order to have special treatment. They know that's an enormous stigma, and every school I've known has been very conscious of that. So I just want to know which school's doing that.
I'm sure that can be provided, Assemblymember Boff, but if...
Not in the future, but...
Well, I won't comment on you shutting up, but Chris, did you want to carry on? And I think Katherine, I can see, sort of wanting to come in there as well. So, Chris, did you want to carry on with that?
I mean, I think from the stories that we were hearing in the summer, and I don't have the names of the schools, but perhaps we can see if we can find out about them. It was very. We have moved on from yellow tickets. Children generally use their fingerprint now to access their free school meal, certainly in secondary schools. But I think what we were hearing is that there were lots of quite subtle ways in which the distinction was still very visible. That children who, because of the spending limit there is on for someone receiving a free school meal, if they overspend, and we were hearing that the prices weren't clear on the food that was available, so children did overspend, and then they were being asked by the is staff to put the food back, whereas children who had a kind of reservoir of money on their account didn't have that problem. So it was quite a lot of subtle ways in which children were being...
So that would be an argument, wouldn't it, not for using the Mayor's resources to bolster the free school meals programme as is, rather than spreading the funds around to kids that can afford it? I mean, more targeting.
Well, I think if they were universally available, that problem wouldn't exist.
Thank you. And the other thing that I do remember from that seminar yesterday was also about the food that children, particularly in secondary schools, where we've established that there isn't universal free school meals, and in secondary schools where there were only certain foods that those who had access to free school meals could actually purchase with the amount of money that they had. Okay, moving on. Now, we are a little bit behind, so I'm going to ask if we could just pick up the pace. Assembly Member Hirani.
Thank you. I will just make one comment, because I've actually visited a school that is, since the free school meals policy came in a couple of weeks ago, and one story sticks to my mind where there was a single parent with 2 children at the school, working part-time, previously ineligible for free school meals, and the impact that it's had on her, saving her over £800 a year as a result of the policy. But also, there is that clear distinction, because previously she had been sending through packed lunches when she couldn't afford any meals for her children. So there is that distinction of the packed lunch corner, if you like, and being able to enjoy the same meal with your peers, sitting alongside your fellow pupils that you've been studying with all day. So it is making a difference, definitely in my constituency in Brent and Harrow. Can't speak for the rest of London, but that's my experience visiting firsthand. So my question actually is on advice in community settings, and my question is to Debbie, really. So what impact has the advice in community settings programme had so far?
Thank you for the question. So advice in community settings, for those of you who don't know, is a project which is about placing in a variety of different places and community-based organisations advisors who can provide welfare advice, and it's we have advisors based in baby banks, in faith organisations, in community organisations that provide support to refugees and those seeking asylum, etc. We have done two evaluations. We've evaluated first year, and the evaluation for the second year is due very soon. We know that in the first year we were able to reach around 6,500 individuals from across around 3,800 households, where we were able to provide advice to individuals about avoiding debt or having debt written off. We were able to provide advice on benefits uptake. We were able to provide advice on access to some of those funds, like local welfare assistance and other various forms of hardship funds available at local authorities. And what this has enabled those individuals to do is to be able to both either to maximise income or to be able to avoid debt, or indeed to be able to find out about a range of other opportunities. And I think one of the things that has been really useful about the advice programmes that we have been running over the past year, certainly, is that it has been able to bring into advice individuals who would not normally reach out and ask for help, but those are the individuals who are most likely to need that help. And those would be individuals who are from minority ethnic backgrounds, women, those who are lone parents, who have many children who don't actually have time to go out and ask for help, and placing welfare advisors in the locations that they frequent enables them, whilst they're there doing perhaps something else, to be able to speak to an advisor and ask a question. So we've been able to enable those individuals to maximise incomes, to find out about help, but also have someone to talk to about huge financial and other difficulties that they're experiencing.
And what are the timescales for the programme, and will it be extended once the current funding comes to an end?
So we've been able to extend it for an additional year. So we've been running it for 1 year, and we've been able to extend it into next year. We don't know about funding beyond that at this stage. We would like to make sure that we see what the evaluation tells us about how many people we've been able to reach. We would obviously love to continue all of the advice programs that we are developing, but obviously we would need to have conversations about the extent to which we would be able to bid for additional money for that to continue. But it definitely is going to run beyond this winter, and with an exact date, Dan, do you know when it comes to an end?
Sorry, with advice in community settings specifically, it varies ever so slightly because different partnerships that have taken part in the programme sort of got up and running at different stages. But essentially, it's a 6-month extension from between sort of now and into early 2024. So 6 months on from then, depending on when those partnerships got up and running, and an extension to the evaluation as well to cover those periods.
Last week I was speaking to a couple in Harrow who were telling me in March their mortgage payments will be going up by £700 a month in March next year. So bearing that in mind with the cost of living hub and also the advice in community settings, can you make sure that you review just to make sure that adequate information or information for signposting is there for a particular group, because we wouldn't have needed to really think about homeowners in the same way as I think we will have to going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thanks, Chair. Debbie, Dan talked earlier about grant funding, of a grant programme funding. Could I ask how the objectives are progressing, particularly with regards to citizens' advice and the London Legal Support Trust?
Yes. So this initiative, which is providing funding for all of the citizens' advice bureaus across the city, as well as the London Legal Support Trust, which is providing advice, first aid to a number of community-based organisations, which is effectively training individuals who are running community organisations so that they can answer questions about welfare should they be approached by someone who is in financial difficulty. This programme has, in combination, reached around 18,000 people so far, and it's been one of our most, it's terrible saying it, but it's been one of our most successful programmes out of all of the programmes that we're running, in that we've been able to get into the pockets of those Londoners that we've been able to speak to work with, to support around £7.1 million in relation to benefits that they were eligible for but didn't realise, access to funding pots, writing off of debt, etc. And so it's an initiative which has been incredibly impactful, not just for those individuals, but also in recognition that we have a funding gap in London in our advice sector of around £13 million. We're only touching the surface with what we're putting into that space or that gap. But what we're doing with that funding is we are trying to address some of the workforce issues. We don't have enough advisors in London who can provide welfare, immigration, legal advice to people who need it in these financially straitened times. And what this particular initiative has enabled us to do is to help Citizens Advice and the London Legal Support Trust to train individuals to become advisors so that they can provide that much needed support to many of the individuals that we've been discussing today, who literally just need someone to let them know where they might be able to get access to a pot of funding, or indeed just to give them access to information that will enable them to make massive changes in the way in which their household finances are organised, which can do wonders in trying to remove their risk of poverty. So it's been a really successful project, certainly in relation to that.
Great to hear. And I believe it's one-off funding, or is one-off funding for now. What impact is this likely to have when the funding falls away?
So it's not well, it's not one-off funding.
Exceptional.
It's not. Yeah. So we've been able to boost it in light of the cost of living crisis, but it's not one-off funding. It's definitely ongoing funding that we've been putting into this particular initiative. And yes, Dan, if you've got some more details, do provide some more.
Sorry, yeah, it was originally a one-off, a one-year grant agreement. We have funding for a second year of delivery, essentially, to sort of continue the programme. So the first year of funding essentially sort of comes to an end around about now. So the idea is that second year of funding should just sort of kick in immediately to sustain it for a second year and through to essentially next autumn.
Thank you. And Debbie, finally, myself and Assemblymember Bokhari recently met with Debt-Free Advice. The staff there were incredible. But aside from that, they were really clear that Klarna and this kind of buy now, pay later was a real issue for people in poverty. I criticised them online, and then Klarna reached out to have a meeting with me. I'm still not convinced. I'm just wondering if you've had any kind of interactions with them at all, or any kind of comments to make on that sector and its relationship with child poverty.
So I've had no conversation with Klarna. I'd be really interested in any kind of conversation that you have with them. Do let me know. I'd love to come along. I think, and I mean, there may be other experts who might be able to reflect on this. The issue with the use of some of these forms of credit, I know, has been extended to individuals who have been using it to pay for their weekly shop, which I know is massively problematic and can lead to real issues with debt. And Debt-Free Advice did talk to us during the process of funding the bus that was going around to different parts of London, and reflected on the way in which that level of debt has really impacted upon particular individuals. And so I think there is a definite conversation that needs to be had with those buy now, pay later organisations. Klarna is but one of many, and I would be really interested in hearing them talk about ways in which they are offering that kind of service for very short-term purchases, like a weekly shop, or something which regularly an individual knows that they have to pay for, which will only increase their levels of debt. So it would be really interesting in hearing about what they say to you.
I'd be really happy to put you in touch. It's nice to work the other way around for once. Thank you, Chair.
Assemblymember Bokhari.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to make a clarification. Assemblymember Harani was rightly to point this out. It was the coalition government that brought in universal free school meals in Key Stage 1. Very proud lived-in policy. Thank you very much. The question that I'm going to be asking is about the Mayor's Energy Advice Service. What has been the impact of the Mayor's Energy Advice Service delivered by the Energy Saving Trust, and how many Londoners has it supported? To Debbie.
So I know that since it was introduced, it's had around just under 2,000 telephone and email engagements with individuals who have been able to access it. I know that in comparison to the Warmer Homes Advice Service, this is a universal an offer to anyone who's experiencing difficulty with payment of their energy bills. And we have been working with the environment team to try to increase the numbers of individuals who are taking up the offer. I think one thing to state at this point is that whilst I'm very proud of obviously all of the initiatives that we develop and deliver to individuals, there are a lot sometimes for people to be able to know which one to access. And so we're working really, really hard with the environment team to try to improve the numbers of individuals who we're able to reach through the Energy Advice London service in particular.
Thank you. Assemblymember Buff.
Yes, sorry, I've lost my place temporarily. The Mayor's free holiday meals programme consists of support for the Felix project. And I'd like to do a free ad for that, the felixproject.org. I'm a donor, a friend of mine is a volunteer. Marvellously targeted organisation. So you're supporting the Felix project as well as providing community partners and hubs with funding. How would you evaluate the performance of those separate strands of the programme?
So the holiday meals programme has been operating since Easter. We're delighted to be working both with Felix Project and also the Mayor's Fund for London. With regards to the Felix Project in particular, the funding that we've been able to give them has allowed them to be able to open 6 days a week, and has allowed them to be able to open. They have 4 warehouses which distribute surplus food to a range of charitable organisations, as you will know, Andrew, across the city and to schools. And what this additional funding has enabled them to do through the holiday meals is to provide just under 2 million meals to families and children on low incomes who are not able to access meals through the holiday activities, the HAF scheme. Holiday activities, what's the F? Food, that's it, sorry. The Holiday Activities and Food Scheme. And so we've been delighted to work with them because we've been able to work in addition to that, that other initiative. The funding for the Mayor's Fund for London has enabled us to, through a variety of community-based organisations, through events, through create and make boxes that they develop, we've been able so far to provide just over 4 million meals, 4.8 million I think it stands at, and the target was 6.9. So I think what's been really exciting about this particular initiative is that through working both with Felix, who provide that surplus food, who enable the food that we provide to be healthy, to also to address issues around surplus food, and with Mayor's Fund for London, we've been able to reach many of those children and families who might not have been able to access meals through the Holiday Activities Fund, Holiday Activity and Food Programme, largely because of eligibility issues, but also through that massive network of community organisations, we've been able to access more children and young people during the holiday. So it's going particularly well.
Sorry, just to sort of clarify on one point, and this is probably just a case of giving full credit where it's due. Yeah. There are two elements to that holiday meals programme. There is the specific sort of delivery during the holiday periods, and then there's the extra capacity that's going to Felix. That delivery during the holiday periods is both Felix and the Mayor's Fund for London. It's not solely the Mayor's Fund for London.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you very much. I was going to ask you, I was going to push you further on metrics, but you've been very forthcoming on that. But if you wanted to surprise, actually, there's some projects that you just know are working, and the Felix projects are just astonishing. As are Pecan. Thank you.
Thank you. The final question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to open to the panel. What impact do you think the Mayor's programmes to address financial hardship are having, and what further action would you like to see the Mayor take to help alleviate child poverty in London? So I'm going to open that out to anybody who'd like to jump in. Don't all jump at once. Katherine.
I think as we've heard, there's very clear direct impact in the initiatives that the Mayor has set up. But I think, as we've also seen today, that the causes of child poverty in our city are very multifaceted. There are a lot of different aspects to it. And some of the major levers are out of the Mayor's hands. Some of these levers do very much sit at national government. What I would advocate for is in addition, and very much in addition to the initiatives that are already ongoing, is that we need to see a wider strategic plan about addressing child poverty in the city. And I think the key guiding principle of that needs to be about taking ourselves further upstream, as I said earlier, and really trying to tackle those root causes as well as addressing the symptoms. I think, we've seen very visible symptoms of child poverty, children who are wearing their coats to bed, children who are too hungry to learn at school. And I think what's come forward has been a response to that, both from all parts of local government and the GLA, and from the voluntary sector as well, to respond to that. So we've seen the initiatives we've heard discussed today. We've seen local authorities responding by opening their spaces as warm spaces, the voluntary sector providing food. But in the fourth richest city in the world, that feels to me to be an inadequate response to child poverty. And I think we need to think more about our collective resource and how we can use that to tackle the causes, I think. I'm not for 1 minute thinking that the things have been done are the wrong things. It's both and, not either or. But I do think one way we can help to kind of bring about that shift is to change our language now from talking about a cost of living crisis, which is being driven by short-term inflationary pressures and which we hope will come to an end before too long, to revert, in a sense, to thinking about child poverty, which has been around in our city for much longer than the last 2 years, 18 months. And I think, going back to where we started at the start of this meeting, thinking about those drivers, particularly housing and childcare, there are also very great initiatives going on around those issues across the GLA and that the Mayor takes up, but they're not always seen through the lens of addressing child poverty. And what I'd like to see is that all joined up together as a strategic response to child poverty in our city.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add to that?
Just very briefly, I think that was absolutely excellent summary in terms of the strategic approach that is needed. And I think that we talk about child poverty and then we talk about poverty often as if they were two separate issues. And I think that's an important thing to look at. And also, I would wholeheartedly agree with the point around being in a crisis mode rather than actually looking at what has brought us here. Yes, we have had shocks in the past few years, but those would have looked very differently if we didn't have decades of in-work poverty and other issues. And I think that's where we need to be looking at how policies that are targeted at alleviation interplay with policies that are looking at long-term solutions, like work around in-work poverty, like living wage, and looking what the possibilities and positive powers are, so that we are not really just in the firefighting mode. I think a lot of the organizations that are our funded partners, it's a constant firefighting. And there isn't the luxury to have long-term thinking. So we are effectively setting up the whole civil society sector for a permanent firefighting mode. And I think we should be very, very worried about that. And just to put a sort of a positive example where interventions can work, and going back to the living wage, because that's one of the things that we are involved in quite a lot, is that's where not just policies and resources matter, but also the soft power. And there are some really good examples of the mayor's fully involved in the campaign, but talking to some of the iconic employers and challenging them, iconic employers in London, and challenging them to become accredited. And really encouraging positive change is really important, because that's where a lot of the change can happen. So not just immediate interventions, but really thinking about, you're investing into the future of the city, you're investing into the future Londoners, and playing a positive part. So I think that there is a lot that can be done in that space, but it needs to be part of that strategy that Katherine was talking about.
Thank you very much. We've now come to the end of our session, an investigation into child poverty in London. I'd like to thank our guests for the really quite superb answers that we've had and the information that you have provided. And thank you for joining us this morning. The committee has a few more items of business to deal with, and at this point I'm supposed to say to you, please feel free to leave. What I'm going to say is, please would you mind waiting just for a minute so that we can take a photo at the end, and whilst we just deal with the rest of this business. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this discussion?
Agreed.
The Economy Committee work programme, can I ask the committee to note its work programme? And the date of the next meeting of this committee is scheduled for 9th of November at 10 a.m. in the chamber here at City Hall. And with regards to any other business, I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting.
Thank you.
Right, photo.